All of the drums, all of the drums. I've never mentioned this before on this channel, but in 2008, I was contemplating quitting music. It's too long to go into now, but I had a string of frustrations, and I didn't think I was getting any better. Then I read a book that changed everything. The book was Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. In it, Gladwell discusses Anders Ericsson and the so-called 10,000-hour rule. Gladwell's interpretation of Ericsson's work has come under some criticism recently, but I'll explain in this lesson why I don't think it necessarily matters. But the Anders Ericsson chapter in Gladwell's Outliers planted a seed. I remember sitting with my buddy Pablo having a beer, explaining how, from this point on, I was all in. Looking back, it seemed the obvious choice. Of course, more and better practice would make someone better at music. Not to mention that my entire frame at the time, that there was no way to enjoy music unless I was one of the greats in some zero-sum contest, seems laughable to me now. But somehow, I'd ended up in a really negative frame of mind. I now realize I was operating under two flawed assumptions. The first, which I've already mentioned, but which I'll talk about in greater depth at the end of the lesson, is that unless I was able to be better than everybody else, it wasn't worth doing music. The second assumption I'm going to put under the microscope is that some people are just born with it, and that unless you're one of those people, you're never going to be good enough. Quickly, a word about what this video is not. I'm not going to relitigate the nature-nurture debate, much less come down firmly on one side, i.e. talent is something you're born with or it's not. To circumvent that entire lawn fight, let's just take as a given the fact that musical ability is some part nature, some part nurture, and some people probably have a knack for it. Whether, as Gladwell asserts, that knack is really just a passion or ability to focus on a subject, or whether some people just get the drum gene. Far more educated people than I have written reams on the subject, and it's still pretty controversial. But I will be taking aim at the lazy assumptions of some who, as far as I know, haven't read any more than I have about the science. Let's start with Anders Ericsson himself. After all, it was Ericsson's work that turned me around. The study Gladwell cites in Outliers took place at a conservatory in Germany. Faculty divided 40 violin students into top performers, average students, and below average students. Then Ericsson and his team looked at a number of factors which might have contributed, trying to isolate talent. His hypothesis was simple. If talent is real, there should be musicians with skill out of proportion with the number of hours they'd practiced. Anderson's researchers cataloged carefully the histories and daily practices of all the musicians in the study. And after they'd analyzed all the data, here was the punchline. All the top performers had practiced at least 10,000 hours and had a routine of far more daily practice than anyone else. There were no top performers who hadn't practiced 10,000 hours. And the last one's my favorite, the one that put the final crack in my inner facade of talent myth and caused me to start to lose my religion. Nobody who would put in 10,000 hours wasn't in the top group. Does that square with real life experience? Pretty much. I've met a lot of talented people over the years. From people like Obed Calvaire and Lee Pearson in college, to people like Mason Guidry and Andy Prado more recently. And if there's anything they all have in common, it's that they practice an astonishing amount. I think Andy once told me he practiced like 6 hours a day. Still, let's get at least the surface problems with Gladwell's interpretation of Ericsson's research out of the way. For starters, let's look at the sample. What if all the participants in Anderson's study had the music gene, as evidenced by the fact that they were already accepted into a competitive music conservatory? What if the 10,000-hour study was really just a study of the differences between already talented people who practiced 10,000 hours or more and already talented people who practiced less? After all, the researchers didn't take any objective measure of skill. They just asked the faculty to rank order their students, What if all the students in the conservatory were already in the top 1% of violinists all over the world? What's more, what if it was talent that gave them the ability to practice that long? Maybe some component of talent is the ability to focus for ridiculous amounts of time on a single skill. And there's almost certainly a survivor bias. Maybe a whole bunch of kids started practicing 4 to 5 hours a day, and only the ones who made quick progress were inspired enough to continue, and hence only the talented ones arrived in Erikson's study. And that's kind of the same as the first critique. So suffice it to say, it's more complicated than simply saying the only component of world-class performance is practicing 10,000 hours. But if some caveats muddy the waters of the 10,000 hour rule, proponents of the opposite position, the idea that no matter how many hours people practice, there's some people who are just born with it, have far more to explain. For starters, Erikson may not have proved that 10,000 hours of deliberate practice is sufficient to be a world-class performer, but he probably proved that it's necessary. To be fair, Erikson also asserts that not all practice is created equal. Unless you're doing what he terms deliberate practice, he says those hours don't count for as much. Anyway, recall that researchers couldn't find any example of a musician who had practiced at least 10,000 hours who hadn't reached that top of the pyramid. So that seems to shoot a hole in the naturally gifted but hardly ever practices myth. The other inconvenient truth for talent purism, as I'll call it, is something Daniel Coyle discusses in his book, The Talent Code, which I covered in the whistling episode, and that's simple evolutionary biology. To put it simply, we humans evolved as generalists, with the ability to learn, rather than as specialists. Imagine somebody with the piano gene or the drum gene 100,000 years ago. What purpose would that serve? Hunting game? Running from predators? Forming alliances? No, it's far more likely that we evolved a set of generalized skills and the ability to learn quickly from feedback, such as that one shape of arrowhead seems to be better at killing game than another. As I mentioned in the whistling episode, what we're really doing is insulating certain pathways within our brain so that the signal travels better and more efficiently, in a process that's called myelination. Did I lose you yet? But what about the other side? David Epstein's book, The Sports Gene. What about the fact that most of the best distance runners in the world come from a single region in East Africa? What about the natural athletes Epstein says in some interviews he's observed, like the pole vaulter who, with a lot less practice and technique, outjumped his opponents, many of whom had put many more hours and had much better technique? Well, certain disciplines are attribute-based. Those disciplines are mostly the ones where differentiation happens at the level of the body. It doesn't matter how good a mind for the game of basketball you have if you're 5'5". You're never going to play in the NBA. To take it further, it appears that the narrower the rule set, the greater role attributes are going to play. In MMA, there are multiple ways to win a fight, so you see a range of different body types. In swimming, however, it's just you and a clock. So, as Epstein observed, when you get to the highest collegiate levels and Olympic levels of swimming, you see a certain consolidation towards a single body type. Same thing obviously for track and field. Sprinters all have a similar body type, which is very different than that for elite distance runners. So, does music happen at the level of the body or at the level of the brain? Is there some inherent physical attribute that's required to play the piano or the drums? It turns out no. If you look at the best concert pianists over the last 100 years, it turns out there's a huge range in body geometries and hand shapes. From very petite women to stocky barrel-chested men, it appears practically any body type can play the piano. One big exception to this appears to be singing, which is based pretty heavily on the pipes you're born with. Are drums attribute-based, as some claim? Do you need a certain body type to generate the leverage or speed required for the drums? Nope. This is Helen De La Rosa. She's tiny, but she sounds like this. Case pretty much closed. So, if even drum skill is developed at the level of the brain, a lot of the sports gene stuff breaks down, and we're back in myelination land. Again, I'm not telling you anything you couldn't read in a couple of bestsellers from the airport bookstore. I'm just trying to synthesize it in a way that helps to answer our question. So, if we're being purely theoretical, there are places talent could hide. So you might need talent plus 10,000 hours. A part of talent might be the interest in the subject and the ability to put in those 10,000 hours. But compare that heavily caveated statement to some of the uncritical cult of talent shit we all probably heard when we were growing up. Here are just a few of my experiences. Both middle school and high school band directors told me I shouldn't feel bad about not getting into certain jazz bands because the players that did get in just had something the rest of us didn't. A friend who was at a famous music camp with me told me that a teacher, after listening to her playing at age 17, told her, if you were gonna have it, I'd probably see it by now. And let me just spend a hot second on the Thelonious Monk competition, which, as of the time I was thinking about participating, had an age limit of 30, and in reference to which some have argued it should have an age limit as low as 25, to make sure they're really discovering the undiscovered talent. At some point, I'm going to devote a whole video to the Monk competition. For now, I'm trying to avoid controversy for a few weeks. I'm not blaming anyone, but when I was considering quitting music in 2008, a lot of this conventional wisdom was rattling around in my head. If I was going to have it, I would have had it by now. I guess I just wasn't born with it. Record scratch. Now's the part where I call bullshit on the whole exercise. Because everything we've been talking about up to this point has to do with becoming world class by some arbitrary measure. This is just another bone I have to pick with the movie. This idea of being one of the greats. What does that even mean? As if they're completely objective measures of what constitutes great in music? To illustrate briefly how ridiculous this is, let's just ask. Who's better? Eric Harland or Nashit Waits? Richard Spavin or Eric Moore? Dirty Loops or the Black Keys? Sure, at the lower levels, you can either play or you can't, and all of the musicians I just mentioned have a very high level of technical proficiency. But my point is, once you've cleared that minimum proficiency bar, which, don't get me wrong, is high, a phrase like one of the greats sort of loses all its meaning. Of course, if it was always artistically false, what made the idea of a finite number of greats at least economically true for part of the 20th century was a limited amount of shelf space at record stores and a finite number of broadcast analog radio stations to play the music on. Of course, both of those limiting factors are now gone. But to zoom out even further, why was I willing to quit music if I couldn't be one of the greats? It came down to a narrow, egoistic view that I had at the time of what music was. A zero-sum contest, rather than as an opportunity to make art and share it. Tucker Max once told an interviewer he could tell if people were going to be successful writers by the words those people used when they would approach him for advice. If they told him they wanted to be writers, Max knew they probably weren't going to succeed. Whereas if they said they wanted to write, he knew they had a chance. So, dear viewer, I ask you, what is music to you? Do you want to wear the identity of music, like a cool t-shirt or tattoo that everybody talks about at parties? If that's the case, you'll probably get bored way before you're done with 10,000 hours. Whether or not that's the ticket to success, and whether or not you need it. However, if the act of making music gives you pleasure, you're on the right track. And if the latter is the case, it's truly never mattered less what else you have going for you. If you love it, you'll do it. And if you do it, you'll get better. And if you get better, you'll want to do it more, and other people want to do it with you. And that'll make you even better. So, is musical talent a myth? Partly. And that's important insofar as it frees you up to stop thinking that you're not entitled to make music because you weren't born with the drum gene or the songwriting gene. And partly not. Even if the Black Keys aren't going to dazzle you with their guitar virtuosity or blazing drum solos. And even if there are many bands as good or almost as good who never got that right time, right place serendipity, there are still thousands of mediocre bands, and even more bad ones for every one Black Keys. We know a big component of getting good is a lot of practice, and it may even include a component of being born with it. But in my opinion, it's the wrong question. The right question is, do I love music enough to do it through the difficult periods? Because then you'll get better, and more importantly, you'll have a reason to get better. Hope you've enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you next week.